Foundations is the next standard legal release. In fact, the full card gallery will be dropping on Friday, and it's our first core set since 2020. If you don't know, core sets are intended to be beginner products, so they frequently have simplified cards and mechanics so as not to overwhelm new players. For the first 17 years of Magic, core sets were entirely made up of reprints, but that all changed with Magic 2010, the first core set to have brand new cards. About half of the set was new, just like with Foundations. So it's a pretty important set in the history of Magic, and that got me to thinking about just how much it had contributed to the game. Core sets are often thought of as weak, since the cards tend to be simpler, but I think we'll see in this video that simple doesn't always mean bad. All of the cards that weren't reprints in Magic 2010 were eligible for this list, excluding the set's dual lands. We all know they're good and were heavily played, so they aren't particularly interesting to look at. With those cards excluded, in this video we'll be looking at the 10 cards in Core Set 2010 that have left the biggest impact on competitive Magic the Gathering. This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. Use the links in the description to visit their store. Before we get started, here's a quick reminder on how I rank cards in these videos. I use a scoring system where cards are awarded 2 points for first tier top 8s like Pro Tours, and 1 point for second tier top 8s like Regional Championships. At number 10, it's Great Sable Stag. For 1 generic and 2 green, it's a 3/3 that can't be countered, and it has protection from blue and black. Color-hating cards like the Stag show up in most core sets, I guess because they often help a player better understand the idea of allied and enemy colors, and because it can be a pretty good way to make sure certain decks don't end up entirely busted in Standard. If you're playing against a Dimir deck, just getting this 3/3 into play is a nightmare for them, and you're likely to get there since it can't be countered. All that has made the Stag a common sideboard card. In Standard, it was often hosing fairy decks, and more recently it's been featured in Legacy sideboards where it's pretty nice against Delver decks. It's also kind of funny that it has protection from Oko, since it's already a 3/3 elk. While it hasn't put up a top 8 since 2023, it's the kind of card that can show up in sideboards again in the right environment, so it's hard to count it out entirely. At number 9, it's Goblin Chieftain. For 1 generic and 2 red, it's a 2/2 with haste, and it gives your other goblins +1/+1 in haste. One of the simplest synergies in all of Magic are creature type payoffs. They are very easy to grasp for new players, and really popular even among experienced players, so most core sets include lords like the Chieftain, which also got reprints in Magic 2011 and Magic 2012. And the Chieftain is a pretty great lord. The fact it grants haste is particularly spicy, because it can allow you to put a mountain of goblins into play in a single turn and swing with them all immediately. While it saw a bit of play in Standard and Modern, Legacy is where it's been the most successful. It saw sporadic play in the format for a while, but the printing of Muxus Goblin Grandee gave Goblin decks in the format a shot in the arm, and the Chieftain is actually very important to their game plan. These decks look to use Food Chain plus Goblin Ringleader and Muxus to get a whole bunch of goblins in play in a single turn. You pull this off by playing lots of cheap goblins who you can draw with the Ringleader, then you sacrifice the Ringleader, put those goblins you drew into play. And Muxus can just put them all into play on his own, and if one of them happens to be a Chieftain, it's probably game over. The Chieftain is likely to keep putting up top 8s in Legacy in the future. At number 8, it's Elvish Archdruid, another lord. For 1 generic and 2 green, it's a 2/2 that gives other elves you control +1/+1, and it can tap to add green for each elf you control. This means the Archdruid not only makes your elves into beefier creatures, it can also turn all those elves into a bunch of mana. It actually has a pretty similar history to Goblin Chieftain, its fellow Core Set 2010 lord. It saw a little bit of play in Standard, but it really took off in formats with larger card pools, particularly formats where Glimpse of Nature is legal. This style of elf deck first emerged in Extended, and the whole game plan is to cast Glimpse, and then draw and play lots of elves who produce mana so you can just draw your entire deck. While Borderland Ranger and Heritage Druid are the ideal elves for the deck, since they can even tap themselves and other creatures for mana that have just entered the battlefield, the Archdruid is still pretty great if it's in play when you go off, because at some point you can tap it and make a bunch of mana to keep the chain of creatures alive. This combo was so strong that Glimpse got preemptively banned in Modern, and it's remained banned there, but it does see play in Legacy. However, that doesn't mean the Archdruid hasn't been played in Modern. While those decks have never had access to Glimpse, they are still capable of going super wide with elves and producing lots of mana that is often sunk into Azuri Renegade Leader's activated abilities, and the Archdruid helps make sure you have the mana for that overrun effect. However, despite a fairly successful history, the Archdruid hasn't put up any top 8 since 2022, and it's likely to be surpassed by Goblin Chieftain in the near future. At number 7, it's Borderland Ranger. For 2 generic and a green, it's a 2/2, and when it enters, you can tutor up a basic land and put it into your hand. There are many iterations of a green 3-drop that search up a land, and they virtually always see play in Standard. After all, it's a 2-for-1 that makes sure you hit your land drop and can even fix your mana. It saw a little bit of play in Standard as a result of its original printing, but it was actually a reprint a few years later, in Avacyn Restored, that led to the Ranger being very successful in both Block and Standard. Both of those formats had lots of 3-colored green decks, like Naya and Jund, and the Ranger was great at making your mana more consistent, and it also worked nicely in Birthing Pod decks, since it was a creature that generated a card worth of value when it entered, and then you could sacrifice it to the pod to search up a better creature. Borderland Ranger hasn't gained any points since it rotated out of Standard, though. At number 6, it's Hive Mind. All the other cards in this list are pretty simple, like core set cards are supposed to be. Hive Mind, not so much. For 5 generic and a blue, it's an enchantment. Whenever a player casts an instant or sorcery, each other player copies that spell, and each of those players can choose new targets for their copy. On its own, this is a really bad card. You never want to give your opponents free spells in Magic, it's a good way to lose. However, there is one really nasty way you can use Hive Mind, and that's by combining it with the Pacts from Future Sight. All of them are free spells, but you have to pay mana on your next upkeep, and if you don't, you lose the game. So the game plan for Hive Mind decks, which have been viable in Modern in the past and are viable in Legacy right now, is to get Hive Mind in play and cast a Pact. Your opponent gets a copy of it and might get some value, but it's of course negated by the fact that they are unlikely to be able to pay the mana on their next upkeep, so they just lose the game. Hive Mind decks aren't racking up a ton of points these days, but they aren't completely irrelevant either, so it may gain a few more points in the future. At number 5, it's Burning Inquiry. For 1 red mana, it's a sorcery, and each player draws 3 cards and then discards 3 cards at random. This is a super powerful effect for only 1 red mana, even if it is symmetrical and random. I mean, it's basically a red Ancestral Recall. Okay, I'm mostly kidding there, but this card is sneaky strong. However, it was a very quiet card for the first several years of its existence, not seeing any play in Standard or Extended. It saw sporadic play in Dredge decks in Modern and Legacy, as any card that can really efficiently draw and discard cards often does. This is because you can potentially dredge with it multiple times and load up your graveyard while discarding even more fuel. However, it was the printing of Hollow One that finally gave Burning Inquiry a regular home in Modern. Those decks are loaded up with ways to draw and discard a bunch of cards to make Hollow One free. Hollow One decks can have the most absurd start of any deck in Modern, since it's possible to cast Inquiry on 1, and then cast like 3 Hollow Ones on turn 1. Most of the time it's only 1 Hollow One, but that's still pretty nasty. Hollow One decks are still relevant in Modern, and tend to be loaded up with lots of draw and discard effects, along with lots of cards you can play from the graveyard, like Nethergoyf and Bloodghast. This means that when you're discarding these cards, it doesn't even really feel like you're discarding them, but you're still getting a discounted Hollow One. While Hollow One decks aren't as big a part of the Legacy metagame, Burning Inquiry also sees play there too. The Inquiry is still racking up points in both Modern and Legacy, and it's got a pretty good shot at moving higher on the list. At number 4, it's Silence. For 1 white mana, it's an instant, and your opponents can't cast spells this turn. If you can cast this during your opponent's upkeep, you can get pretty close to time walking them, which is pretty nasty, and casting it during your own turn can be a good way to make it harder for your opponent to disrupt whatever you're trying to do, and indeed, all of Silence's points have come in Modern and Legacy combo decks. Combos can win you the game in a single turn, but if you don't do something to take your opponent out of the equation, it isn't that hard for a combo to be disrupted. Silence makes it so you don't have to worry about that. Silence is going to continue to put up top 8s in the future, and the card in front of it has been inactive for a while, so I think we should expect it to move up the list soon. However, right now that number 3 card is Acidic Slime. For 3 generic and 2 green, the slime is a 2/2 with Death Touch that destroys an artifact, enchantment, or land when it enters the battlefield. Thanks to that enters trigger and Death Touch, most of the time the slime represents a 2-for-1. Acidic Slime gained most of its points in Standard, a format it had a bunch of time in thanks to 4 separate core set reprints. It's mostly been a sideboard card, one that could deal with dominant cards in the format like Valakut Molten Pinnacle, Birthing Pod, and the various equipment played in Cobblade decks. It was also briefly played in Modern Birthing Pod decks since it was a good thing to tutor up with the pod when it had a good target, like an opposing Birthing Pod. If Acidic Slime were reprinted, it might be played in Standard again, and I don't think it's impossible it shows up in Foundations, but if that doesn't happen, I don't think it will gain any more points. At number 2, it's Baneslayer Angel. For 3 generic and 2 white, it's a 5/5 that comes with flying, first strike lifelink, and protection from demons and dragons. Baneslayer Angel is a frightening creature that is hard to block and hard to attack through, and it also gains a ton of life for the player who controls it. That combination is ideal for control decks in multiple formats, as it becomes a card that can stabilize you and close out the game for you. The Angel was a part of the Doomblade deck that dominated Standard in 2011, and it's also been played in modern control deck sideboards. The Angel actually got a reprint in our most recent core set before Foundations, which was core set 2021, and it took advantage of that too, seeing play in Standard and becoming legal in Pioneer for the first time. The Angel isn't seeing an insane amount of play right now, but it's also not entirely done putting up top 8s, especially in Pioneer. And at number 1, it's Doomblade. For 1 generic and a black, it's an instant that can destroy target non-black creature. A fairly iconic removal spell at this point, Doomblade can really efficiently destroy almost any creature, and it can do it at instant speed. While it pairs in comparison to the removal that's legal in the Eternal formats, Doomblade has seen play in every other format it's ever been legal in, but it was especially dominant in Standard. This is partly a result of several Standard reprints, and you can bet if it ever gets reprinted in Standard again, it will see heavy play again. In the long run, some of the other cards on the list might catch up to Doomblade, especially if it never gets a reprint, but it has a pretty big lead, so it might be a while. So those are the top 10 cards in Core Set 2010. If you want to own any of these powerful Core Set cards, check out the description where you can find a direct Card Kingdom link for each card that appeared in the video. Also, if you want to pre-order Magic's next core set, Foundations, there should be a Card Kingdom link for that in the description too. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to catch up on past videos, including many more that look at specific sets, you should see a playlist on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.